before any human ever looked down at Earth from the blackness of space, before any astronaut felt the silence of the cosmos, before any mission was declared a triumph, something else was sent up first. Something that could not volunteer, something that could not sign a waiver, something that could not understand what was happening to it, or why, or that it was never coming home. This is not a story about glory. This is not a story about flags and heroes and ticker tape parades. This is the story that happens before all of that, the dark, uncomfortable, morally complicated chapter that the history books tend to rush past. This is the story of the creatures who went to space first, who made everything that followed possible, and who paid for it with their lives. And the deeper you look into this story, the more disturbing it becomes. Not because of conspiracy, not because of fabricated secrets, but because of the plain, documented, undeniable truth of what was done and why. To understand why animals were sent into space, you have to understand the fear that gripped the world in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. The Second World War had just ended, and in its aftermath, two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, found themselves locked in a cold, shadowless competition that would define the next 4 decades. It was a race for dominance, a race for prestige, and very quickly it became a race for space. Both nations had captured German rocket technology at the end of the war. Both nations had scientists, some of them former Nazi engineers, working frantically to build rockets that could pierce the sky and reach beyond it. The science was moving faster than the safety. The ambition was running far ahead of the knowledge. And the most dangerous unknown of all was this: could a living body even survive in space? Nobody knew, not for certain. The human body had never left Earth's atmosphere. No one understood what weightlessness would do to the heart, to the lungs, to the blood. No one knew whether a living creature could breathe in a sealed capsule for hours while hurtling through a vacuum at thousands of miles per hour. The cosmic radiation beyond the atmosphere was still poorly understood. The pressure changes, the vibration during launch, the forces pressing down on the body as a rocket accelerated, all of it was theoretical. All of it was frightening. So before they sent a human, they sent animals. First in small suborbital flights, and then, as the rockets grew stronger and the ambition grew bolder, into orbit itself. And what happened to those animals reveals something unsettling about the nature of that era, about the choices made in the name of science and national glory, and the cost those choices carried. The very first animals to reach the boundary of space were not dogs or monkeys or chimpanzees. They were fruit flies. In February 1947, the United States launched a captured German V-2 rocket from White Sands, New Mexico, with a payload that included fruit flies and some seeds. The rocket reached an altitude of around 109 kilometers, just past the edge of what we now define as space. The capsule was recovered and the flies were alive. That was the beginning. But fruit flies could not tell scientists what they really needed to know. They needed to understand what happened to a mammal, to something physiologically closer to a human being. And so the experiments escalated. The United States turned to monkeys. Beginning in 1948, a series of rhesus monkeys were launched aboard V-2 rockets under a program that carried the quietly clinical designation of Albert flights. The first, known as Albert First, flew in June 1948. The details of that mission are incomplete and in some accounts disputed, but it appears the monkey did not survive the flight, likely suffocating before the rocket even reached its peak altitude. Albert II flew in June 1949 and successfully reached an altitude of about 134 kilometers, making him the first primate in space. He survived the flight itself, but the parachute system failed on descent and the capsule slammed into the ground. Albert II died on impact. Albert III died when the rocket exploded during the flight. Albert IV reached space but died on impact, again due to parachute failure. Albert V, Albert VI. Each mission carried a living creature skyward, and the outcomes were overwhelmingly fatal. Let that settle for a moment. These were repeated, deliberate decisions to send animals on missions where the probability of death was high and sometimes near certain. The scientists knew the parachute systems were not reliable. They knew the survival rate was low, and they kept going. Because the data was valuable. Because the pressure to advance was immense. Because the Cold War did not pause for ethical reflection. But as disturbing as the American monkey flights were, it is the Soviet program, and one mission in particular, that has become the most haunting chapter in the history of animal space exploration. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union began its own biological rocket program, choosing to work primarily with dogs rather than monkeys. Soviet scientists believed dogs were more trainable and better suited for the confined conditions of a rocket capsule. They selected stray dogs from the streets of Moscow, the reasoning being that stray dogs were already accustomed to hardship, to cold, to discomfort, and were therefore tougher and more adaptable than pets. Between 1951 and 1952, Soviet scientists conducted a series of suborbital flights using dogs. Two dogs, Dezik and Sigan, flew on a suborbital mission in July 1951 and were recovered alive. This was a genuine milestone. But Dezik flew again shortly afterward, and on that second mission, she did not survive. The deaths accumulated. Roughly half of the dogs used in these early suborbital flights did not come back alive. The Soviets studied each result, adjusted their equipment, refined their life support systems, and pressed forward. There was a goal beyond science driving all of it. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, and the shockwave it sent through the West was enormous. The Soviets had reached orbit first. The psychological and political implications were staggering, and within weeks, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was already demanding a follow-up triumph, something even more dramatic, something that would cement Soviet superiority in the minds of the entire world. He wanted it launched by November 7, 1957. The 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. He wanted a living creature in orbit. The scientist had weeks to prepare, not months, not years, weeks. Her name was Laika. She was a stray dog, a small mixed breed, probably part Samoyed Terrier. She had been found on the streets of Moscow. She was calm under pressure, easy to handle, good-natured. Soviet scientists found her well-suited for the mission. They called her Laika, which means barker in Russian. In the West, she was sometimes called Mutnik, a playful jab at the Soviet Sputnik, but Laika was her name, and it is the name that history remembers. On November 3, 1957, Laika was sealed into the capsule of Sputnik 2 and launched into orbit. She became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. And from the very beginning, the people who sent her there knew she was not coming back. Sputnik 2 was designed without a re-entry system. There was no way to bring the capsule back safely. The technology did not exist yet, and there was no time to develop it. Laika was going to orbit the Earth until the capsule's life support ran out. That was the plan. That was always the plan. The Soviet government at the time stated publicly that Laika survived for about a week in orbit before the oxygen ran out, and she died peacefully. For decades, this was the official account. Many people believed it. It was not true. In 2002, more than 4 decades later, a Russian scientist named Dmitry Malyshenkov presented findings at a World Space Congress that changed the historical record permanently. The thermal control system inside Sputnik 2 had malfunctioned. The capsule overheated. Laika, according to this research, died from heat stress and panic within hours of launch, possibly within 5 to 7 hours. Not a week, hours. One of the Soviet scientists who worked on the mission, Oleg Gazenko, had spoken about Laika years earlier with what can only be described as regret. He acknowledged that they had not done enough to preserve her life, and that the knowledge gained from the mission did not, in his view, justify what was done. That is not a paraphrase or an exaggeration. That is the documented reflection of a man who was there, who worked on it, who felt the weight of it for the rest of his life. Laika orbited the Earth more than 2,000 times before Sputnik 2 disintegrated upon re-entry into the atmosphere in April 1958. She never came home. Now, this is the point in the story where some people introduce conspiracy theories, claims that the Soviets deliberately covered up mass animal deaths, that dozens of cosmonauts also died secretly before Yuri Gagarin, that the entire space race was built on a mountain of hidden corpses. It is important to be precise here. What the historical record actually shows is disturbing enough without embellishment. The Soviets did suppress accurate information about Laika's death. They did present a sanitized and false version of events for decades. That is documented and confirmed. But the broader conspiratorial claim that the Soviets secretly launched and lost human cosmonauts before Gagarin is not supported by credible evidence. The primary sources for these claims, such as recordings by the Giudica Cordiglia brothers in Italy, who claim to intercept dying cosmonaut transmissions, have never been verified, and Soviet records opened after the Cold War do not support a pattern of secret human deaths in orbit before Gagarin's flight in April 1961. The real history is ethically complicated enough. The real history has Laika. It has the Albert flights. It has decisions made under political pressure that cost animal lives. The truth doesn't need to be inflated. After Laika, the Soviet biological program continued. In August 1960, 2 dogs named Belka and Strelka were launched aboard Sputnik 5, and this time the spacecraft was equipped with a re-entry system. Both dogs returned to Earth alive. Strelka later had puppies, and one of them, a puppy named Pushinka, was given as a gift to the family of American President John F. Kennedy. Pushinka lived out her days as a White House pet, a small, living footnote to the space race. But not all the missions that followed ended in survival. In December 1960, a spacecraft carrying 2 dogs, Chelka and Mushka, successfully completed its orbital mission but ran into trouble during re-entry. The spacecraft entered the atmosphere at the wrong angle, and there was a real possibility it might land outside Soviet territory, possibly even in the hands of Western intelligence. the Soviets activated a self-destruct mechanism. The spacecraft and the two dogs inside it were deliberately destroyed to prevent the technology from being recovered. Read that again. The dogs were destroyed not because of a technical failure, not because of an accident, but as a deliberate decision, a choice made to protect state secrets. Pchelka and Mushka were sacrificed not in the pursuit of knowledge, but in the pursuit of secrecy. On the American side, the path to human spaceflight ran through chimpanzees. In January 1961, a chimpanzee named Ham, named after the Holloman Aerospace Medical Center in New Mexico, was launched on a suborbital Mercury flight. Ham had been trained to perform tasks during the flight, pulling levers in response to lights, which allowed scientists to assess whether a living creature could still function cognitively in space. Ham survived his mission, though it was not without difficulties. The capsule experienced a slightly higher acceleration than planned, and Ham endured more force than anticipated. He was recovered from the Atlantic Ocean, and the photographs taken of him afterward, his mouth pulled back in what looks like a grimace but was likely a stress response, became iconic. Enos the chimpanzee flew in November 1961 in orbital flight and also survived, paving the way for John Glenn's historic orbital mission just months later. But the path was not clean. Dozens of primates, across multiple programs spanning years, did not survive their missions. They died in hardware failures, in parachute malfunctions, in accidents on recovery. The record of animal experimentation in space is long, and it is not a comfortable one. There is a question that has followed all of this history, growing louder as the decades passed and as ethical standards evolved. Was it necessary? Was it right? The scientific answer is complicated. The data gathered from these animal flights genuinely was crucial. It informed the design of life support systems, the understanding of how the body responds to launch forces and weightlessness, and the protocols for keeping humans alive in space. Some of the researchers who worked on these programs have defended them on those grounds, and there is a factual basis for that defense. But there is another question layered underneath the scientific one. The animals sent into space, the dogs, the monkeys, the chimps, were given no choice. They were taken from streets or laboratories or breeding programs, trained to tolerate conditions they did not understand, placed in capsules, and launched into the unknown. Some were recovered. Many were not. Some died in flight. Some died on impact. Some were deliberately destroyed. And for a long time, the public was either not told or was told something false. Oleg Gazenko, the Soviet scientist, put it simply when he spoke about Laika later in his life. He said that the more time passed, the more sorry he felt about it. He said they had not learned enough from the mission to justify the death. That kind of honesty, arriving decades late, carries its own kind of weight. When Yuri Gagarin climbed into Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961, and became the first human being to orbit the Earth, the world celebrated. There were parades and speeches and headlines. It was a moment of genuine, extraordinary human achievement. And it was built on a foundation that included Laika and Dezik and the animals whose names most people never learned and never will. When Alan Shepard became the first American in space weeks later, and when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in February 1962, those achievements were real, and they mattered. And they were made possible in part by Ham and Enos and the unnamed monkeys of the Albert series. The animals did not know they were pioneers. They did not know they were part of history. They knew cold capsules and bright lights and the smell of the scientists who handled them, and perhaps at the moment of launch, something overwhelming and terrifying and completely beyond their comprehension. Space history is often told as a story of human courage. And it is that, but it is also a story of human ambition running faster than human conscience. It is a story of decisions made under enormous political pressure, where ethics were an afterthought and secrecy was a tool. It is a story where animals died not in the wilderness or in the natural order of things, but in metal capsules above the atmosphere, by the deliberate choices of human beings who needed to know if it could be done. The stars above us are beautiful. The act of reaching for them was extraordinary, but the road that led there was not clean. It was not painless. It was not honest, not always. And the creatures who traveled it first, the ones who never came back, the ones whose deaths were lied about, the ones who were destroyed to protect state secrets, they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes, but as the dark and complicated truth that lives inside every moment of triumph. Before the glory, there was the sacrifice. Before the heroes, there were the ones who had no choice. Laika is still up there, in a way. The atoms that made her are still circling somewhere in the story of the cosmos. And the least we can do, the very least, is remember what was done, say it plainly, and refuse to look away.